She thought she was doing the right thing. In a crowded restaurant full of laughter and meals being served, one table sat cold and quiet. A proud old Marine, alone, with nothing to eat. The young waitress couldn't ignore him. With compassion, in her heart she offered him a warm plate of chicken and rice. But just as kindness was served, cruelty stormed in. The manager's fury erupted across the cafe, and what happened next silenced everyone. In the heart of a busy downtown restaurant, the air buzzed with chatter, clinking glasses, and the hum of casual conversation. But at one corner table, an old black Marine sat alone. His uniform was neatly pressed, his shoulders still straight with dignity, but his plate was empty. Customers glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with cold avoidance, as if his presence made them uncomfortable. He didn't ask for anything. He just sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him, the weight of memories and service hanging invisibly over him like a silent medal. Amara, a young black waitress no older than 23, noticed him immediately. She was balancing 3 orders, managing drink refills, and dodging the entitled snaps of rude customers, but her eyes kept drifting back to the man in the corner. Something about his silence pierced her heart. He reminded her of her late grandfather, also a veteran, who never liked to speak about the war but carried its echoes in his eyes. As she passed by the old Marine's table one more time, she couldn't take it anymore. With her own money, she paid for a fresh plate of chicken, rice, and a side of greens. She brought it over gently and placed it in front of the Marine. "Sir," she said softly, "on the house. Thank you for your service." His eyes welled up, lips trembling as he nodded a silent thank you, hands shaking slightly as he reached for the fork. Then, the restaurant door flew open. The manager, a tall man, in his late 40s with a red tie and a reputation for cruelty, had returned from a meeting. He scanned the floor, his eyes stopping dead on the plate of food in front of the Marine. He stormed over, his voice booming through the dining room. "Who authorized this? Who gave him food?" Everyone went quiet. "I did," Amara said, standing, tall though her voice cracked. "You're not paid to feed strays," he bellowed. "This is a business, not your charity mission. You're fired." Gasps spread across the room. The Marine looked down, as if trying to disappear. "And you?" The manager turned on the veteran. "Get out! You're making customers uncomfortable." Before anyone could react, he shoved the plate off the table and with a burst of rage, struck the Marine in the shoulder. The room froze. Then came the sound of boots. The front door opened again, and in walked 4 Marines in full uniform, 2 black, 1 Latino, and 1 white. They were young, proud, and sharp-eyed. One of them stepped forward and said, "We were down the block, heard what happened." He pointed at the manager. "Touch him again, and we'll file federal charges." The manager backed up, stuttering. But it was too late. Customers began standing up. One by one, people voiced their disgust. "He's a veteran. She did the right thing. You're the problem." Phones came out, recording. A woman called the local news. A teenager live-streamed it. Within minutes, the place was a storm of justice. The old Marine, still seated, was now surrounded by a protective circle. Amara knelt beside him, her hand on his back. "You're not invisible," she whispered. "Not anymore." The manager was escorted out by the same 4 Marines, who didn't lay a hand on him, but walked behind him until he vanished into the street. Amara, still shaking, was offered a job by a customer who owned a nearby soul food restaurant. "We need heart like yours," he said. That evening, the story went viral. Waitress fired for feeding black veteran, then Marines stormed the restaurant. News stations aired the footage. The restaurant chain issued an apology. But more importantly, donations flooded in for the old Marine, who had been living in a shelter. By the end of the week, he had an apartment, a job as a local school counselor, and the pride of knowing that not only had he served his country, but this time, his country stood up for him. And Amara? She didn't just serve food that day, she served justice. The days that followed were unlike anything Amara had ever experienced. What began as a small act of kindness had become a national moment. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Interview, requests, job offers, messages from strangers thanking her for her courage. But she didn't care about fame. All she wanted was to make sure the old Marine was okay. His name was Sergeant Major Harold Pierce, 82 years old, a veteran of 2 wars, Purple Heart recipient, Bronze Star. He had served this nation longer than most of the people in that restaurant had been alive, and yet he'd been treated like less than nothing. That kind of injustice had broken Amara's heart, but now it lit a fire in her. She visited Harold at his new apartment, which had been donated by a local veterans housing program. It was modest, a small one-bedroom with clean white walls and a tiny balcony that overlooked a patch of trees. But to Harold, it was a palace compared to the shelter. "I didn't think anybody still saw me," Harold said quietly as he sipped warm tea from a chipped mug Amara brought him. "I saw you," she said, smiling through tears, "and now they do too." Later that week, a community ceremony was held in the park near the restaurant. Hundreds showed up, veterans, families, community leaders, students, reporters. The mayor presented Amara and Harold with awards. A civil courage citation for her and a long-overdue public recognition of service for him. But the most powerful moment came when one of the young Marines who had walked into the restaurant that day took the stage. "My name is Lieutenant Corey Sanders," he began, "and Sergeant Major Harold Pierce was the reason I joined the Corps. He trained my father. He mentored dozens of young men who came from nothing and gave them the strength to believe they could be something. That man changed lives before most of us were born." The crowd erupted in applause, many wiping tears from their cheeks. Harold stood, slowly, and gave a proud salute. Amara stood beside him and raised his arm with hers. They had become symbols of courage, of dignity, of truth, in a world that often forgets its heroes and punishes kindness. But more than anything, they were human beings who reminded everyone watching that compassion still mattered. The restaurant where it all happened closed within a week. Protests outside, boycott campaigns online, even former employees walked out in solidarity. But from its ashes came something new. With the help of community donations and veteran organizations, Amara and Harold opened their own place, Pierce's Table. A small cafe with worn wood floors, military patches and photographs decorating the walls, and a single sign that read, "All are welcome, no one eats alone. Veterans eat free, the poor eat free. Anyone who walks in hungry is given a hot meal, a warm seat, and a listening ear." Harold greets every guest with a handshake and a story. Amara runs the kitchen with laughter and fierce love. The place quickly became a beacon, not just for food, but for healing, for honor, and for the power of standing up when it matters most, and when young people walk in, unsure of their place. In the world, they often hear Harold say with that proud Marine glint in his eye, "Kindness is the bravest thing you can do. That girl fed me more than food that day. She gave me my name back." And every single person who leaves Pierce's Table carries that name with them, because of one young woman, one old man, and 4 Marines who refused to let injustice win. Months passed, and Pierce's Table wasn't just a cafe anymore. It became a movement. Stories began to pour in from across the country. Veterans who had felt invisible for years now had a place that represented them. Families who couldn't afford meals found warmth in the cafe's generosity. People of all backgrounds sat together. Black, white, Latino, Asian, rich, poor, old, young, sharing tables, stories, and respect. It was like every plate came with a reminder, "You matter here." Amara had become a voice, not just in her community, but nationwide. She was invited to speak at universities, veterans halls, and national conferences. Yet she always returned to the kitchen, hands in gloves, apron smudged, dishing out meals with love. "I'm not here to be famous," she often said. "I'm here to feed souls." Sergeant Major Harold Pierce, though now walking a bit slower, came every day. Rain or shine, he stood at the front door in his marine blazer, opening it for every guest like a guardian of kindness. Sometimes he'd simply say, "Welcome home," and people would break into tears, not just from the words, but from the way he said them, like he meant it. One snowy afternoon, something unexpected happened. A long black car pulled up outside the cafe. Out stepped 3 men in suits, followed by a familiar face, General Darnell Thomas, the highest-ranking African-American in the U.S. Marine Corps. Cameras followed him, but he waved them off and entered quietly. He approached Harold with a crisp salute. "Sergeant Major Pierce," he said, voice strong but reverent. "You trained my uncle. You trained leaders who trained me. The Corps is what it is because of men like you." Harold stood slowly, a bit surprised, and saluted back. "Never expected this." "We've failed in how we honored you," the general said, "but not anymore." He reached into his jacket and presented a golden plaque and a red and gold medal, the Marine Corps' highest civilian recognition. Then he turned to Amara. "And you," he said, reminded the world of what honor looks like in action. A standing ovation erupted inside the cafe. Even the cooks stepped out, teary-eyed and clapping. Guests hugged strangers. Someone started singing, "Lean on me." And within minutes the cafe felt like a church of hope. The story made headlines again. But Amara still came in the next morning before dawn, as usual. Coffee brewed, biscuits baked. She wiped down every table herself. That same day, a teenage boy walked in, skinny, hoodie half-zipped, bruises on his arm. He sat at a corner table and stared at the wall. Harold walked over and sat beside him without asking. "You eaten, son?" The boy shook his head. "You will now," Harold said, waving Amara over. "Get him something warm." The boy ate slowly, cautiously. Then he whispered, "I saw you on TikTok. Everyone at school talks about this place." Harold nodded. "That's good." "I don't have a dad," the boy said. Harold placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've got one now." By closing time, the boy was sweeping the floor with a smile, and that's how it went. Every week, someone new found their way in. A runaway girl, a homeless vet, a single mom, a broken-hearted teacher. And every time, Amara and Harold were there. Not just with food, but with presence, protection, and the unspoken promise that you are never alone again. Eventually, other cities began to copy Pierce's table. Veterans and civilians opened similar cafes across America, all under a simple motto painted above every door: "Honor lives here." And it all began with one act of kindness, one plate of chicken and rice. One young black woman who saw someone most people chose to ignore. She fed a Marine, and in return, she fed a nation's soul. As Pierce's table continued to grow in heart and impact, something extraordinary began to happen. Letters. Thousands of them. Handwritten, typed, emailed, scribbled on napkins, drawn in crayons by children. Letters from veterans who had never spoken about their service. From elderly women who remembered segregation but saw hope again in Amara's story. From college students inspired to start volunteer programs. From young black girls who said, "I want to be like her." Some were from soldiers overseas. One, read, "We saw the video from the cafe here in our base in Kabul. We cried. We saluted. And we remembered why we serve. Please tell Amara and Sergeant Major Harold they gave us back our pride." Amara and Harold read every single one. Every wall in the cafe was soon lined with framed letters. Not for decoration, but as living proof that one moment, one heart-led decision, had become a national heartbeat. But with that recognition came more challenges too. One day, a man in a crisp suit entered with a forced smile. He represented a national franchise, a restaurant chain that had once fired Amara. He offered to buy Pierce's table. "We'd love to help you expand," he said. "Turn this into a brand." Amara looked at Harold. Harold didn't blink. "This place isn't for sale. It's sacred ground." The man chuckled nervously. "Think of the money. Think of the reach." Amara stepped forward, eyes steady. "We already reach the people who matter. You want to copy us, do it. But don't try to own us. You didn't build this." The man left, and donations tripled. The next day when word got out. That very weekend, a massive food drive took place, organized by a coalition of churches, mosques, and temples. Amara stood on stage beside Harold and the 4 Marines who had defended him that fateful day. They had become part of the cafe's family now, mentors to local youth, helpers in the kitchen, speakers in schools. Each one credited Harold and Amara for showing them that strength wasn't just about standing tall, it was about standing for someone. Then came the documentary. A filmmaker from New York had followed the story from day one. With permission, he filmed for months. The final product, The Table That Changed America, aired nationwide. It showed footage of Harold quietly peeling potatoes, Amara hugging a grieving widow, a boy who used to steal food now volunteering proudly in the kitchen. The film ended with a simple scene, Harold and Amara sitting across from each other as the sun set behind the cafe windows. "You think we did enough?" Amara asked. Harold smiled. "No, we just started." The audience stood in tears. Applause thundered across theaters. Viewers everywhere pledged to feed one soul that week, inspired by the movement. Eventually, the President of the United States invited Amara and Harold to the White House. In the East Room, under the glow of chandeliers, they stood before a sea of press and politicians. But they weren't nervous. They wore the same simple clothes they always wore. Amara still had flour on her sleeve. Harold's Marine blazer was faded, but his spine stood taller than ever. The President spoke. "Today we honor not just a woman who fed a hungry man, and not just a man who served his nation with valor, but 2 people who reminded us what America should look like." When asked what she wanted most from all this, Amara replied, "I don't want statues. I want change. I want every restaurant, every street, every school to ask, who's being left out, and then do something about it. That's how we move forward." Harold added softly, "And don't wait for permission to do the right thing. You just do it. Somebody's always watching." The speech was played on every major news outlet, but the next morning, Amara and Harold were right back at Pierce's table, cleaning up, opening doors, smiling at the regulars, hugging the newcomers. One morning, a little girl, maybe 7 years old, stood by the front counter holding her mom's hand. She looked at Amara and said, "Are you the lady who made the world nicer?" Amara knelt down and smiled. "No, sweetie. I just reminded people how." And so the story of Pierce's table lives on, not as a viral moment, but as a daily mission. Not as a headline, but as a habit. Not as a memory, but as a movement. Because one young woman chose kindness over fear. Because one old Marine never lost his dignity, even when the world tried to take it. And because somewhere in the middle of a noisy world, someone still believes that no one should ever eat alone. Years rolled on, but Pierce's table never faded. It flourished. The once small cafe, built on the courage of a waitress and the dignity of a Marine, had become more than a community landmark. It had become a sanctuary of humanity in a world that too often forgets its heart. Yet, for all the praise and media, the soul of the place never changed. The doors still opened early, the coffee still brewed fresh, and the first plate of food still always went to the first person who walked in hungry. Sergeant Major Harold Pierce became a beloved figure far beyond the city. His face was now in textbooks beside quotes about dignity and honor. His story was told in schools, his voice heard in documentaries, and his spirit etched into murals painted by students across the country. Yet every morning, he still came in, before sunrise, slowly sweeping the sidewalk in front of the cafe with one hand and holding a thermos of hot tea in the other. And Amara, still humble, still in her apron, never let fame steal her focus. She trained new hires herself, made sure everyone knew names before they knew titles, and always asked one question first when someone applied to work there. Why do you care? Then came the day no one was ready for. Harold didn't show up. It had never happened. Not in 10 years. Not through illness, not through snowstorms, not even when he cracked 2 ribs helping unload a truck of canned goods. Concern rippled instantly through the community. Amara rushed to his apartment, only to find the front door slightly open, a cup of tea untouched on the counter, and Harold, sitting peacefully in his chair, his medals laid across his lap. He had passed quietly, with the same grace and strength that had defined his life. That day, the world wept. The news broke across every channel. Sergeant Major Harold Pierce, hero of heart and country, passes at 92. Flags flew at half-staff. The president released a statement. Veterans groups held candlelight vigils. But no memorial could match what happened back home. Thousands gathered outside Pierce's table, candles in hand. People stood in silence, those Harold had fed, those he had protected, those he had inspired. Some knelt, some prayed. All remembered. Amara walked out the front doors in her apron, face streaked with tears, holding Harold's marine cover in her hands. She stepped onto a crate and raised her voice. He wasn't just a Marine. He was our foundation. He was the reason this table was built. And now, we carry it forward. A week later, on what would have been Harold's 93rd birthday, a bronze statue was unveiled in front of the cafe. It showed him sitting at a table, arm extended, offering a seat to anyone willing to sit and be seen. At the base, 3 words were carved into stone: "Sit with dignity." But even after his passing, Harold's presence never left. Young men who once sat in silence now stood, up to speak in his name. Girls who once felt invisible now ran youth programs bearing Amara's and Harold's names. Pierce's table became a model for 100 other cafes, each one built on the belief that no one is unworthy of care, and no act of kindness is ever wasted. And Amara? She kept going. Decades later, her hair now streaked with silver, she still came in every morning. She still served the first plate. She still trained every new worker with the same quiet fire. And sometimes, when the sun hit the windows just right, and the cafe was full of laughter and warmth, she'd look toward the statue and whisper, "We're still feeding them, Harold." And somehow, in the hush of those golden moments, it always felt like he was still sitting right there. Because heroes never really leave. Not when you build a world in their honor, not when you serve others in their name, and not when you keep the table open forever for the next soul who just needs someone to say, "You are seen, you are loved, you belong." Years turned into decades, but the light of Pierce's table never dimmed. In fact, it burned brighter with every story added to its walls. Amara eventually passed the daily operations to a new generation, many of whom were once hungry children she had fed, or struggling teens Harold had counseled. One of them, a soft-spoken girl named Layla, who had first entered the cafe barefoot and abandoned at age 9, now wore a crisp white chef's coat and ran the kitchen with the same soulful intensity Amara once did. Another, Marcus, a former foster child who had been caught stealing apples before Harold invited him in, now ran the youth program that mentored thousands across the state. And so it continued. No corporate logos, no flashy marketing, just a handwritten chalkboard outside every day that said, "Welcome, come in. Let us know if you need more love than food." National leaders would still stop by, quietly, without press or security. Celebrities came anonymously, just to sit in the warmth of the place. But Pierce's table never bragged, never advertised. It didn't need to. It lived in hearts. Amara lived well into her late 80s. On her final day, she was seated by the window, wrapped in a handmade quilt of patches from every city that had adopted the cafe's model. She was surrounded by her staff, her kids, and thousands of thank you cards that lined the room like wallpaper made of gratitude. She looked out at the sun hitting Harold's statue and whispered, "We did it, old man." Her final request wasn't for flowers or a memorial. It was for one simple thing: feed someone tomorrow in my name. Just one. Then tell them why. And so they did. And they still do. Every year, on the anniversary of that fateful day when Amara gave Harold a plate of chicken and rice, every Pierce's table across the country serves a free meal to anyone who walks in. No questions asked. They call it the Day of Dignity. And across cities, towns, rural roads, and neighborhoods once forgotten, that same spirit lives on, because the power of that story didn't end in the restaurant. It echoed through generations. It lives in every quiet act of defiance against indifference. It breathes in every soul who chooses to see the unseen. She didn't do it for glory. He didn't ask to be remembered. But together, a young black waitress and an old black Marine sparked a movement that changed a nation, not with money, power, or protest, but with a plate of food and the courage to say, "You matter." And now, somewhere out there, someone is sitting alone at a table, tired, forgotten, hungry, and they don't know it yet, but someone is coming with a plate and a smile. Because kindness never dies, and the table is still open.